of you, those old enough now to have grandkids in college, remember fondly your time on campus in the 60s. You tell your grandkids about a carefree, technicolor world of flowers, frisbees, and music. Maybe if you're still liberal, or if you want to make a point about risky behavior, you even tell them about the sex and drugs. But for us, members of the Fordham University chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, we remember the 60s in black and white. A little darker, a little angrier, a lot more violent. We were in the Bronx, and we were pissed. Both Fordham University and the Bronx were different back then. Back then, Fordham was mostly a commuter school attracting first-generation strivers from blue-collar families. Those of us from out of town or the outer boroughs lived in cheap off-campus apartments in what would soon be known as the South Bronx. Now the Bronx is reborn, and Fordham is among the top 100 of America's universities. The nearly $40,000 a year cost and high rejection rate guarantees a student body of smart middle-class students from the country's Catholic elite. Back then, neither the Fordham administration nor our parents understood how we were living, just how far off campus we really were. They still imagined a post-Depression Bronx of radio and TV shows, of cozy and tidy Irish and Jewish neighborhoods, home to Molly Goldberg and Milton Berle. They hadn't looked beyond the high wrought iron walls along Fordham Road, but we lived in the real Bronx. We were freshly arrived white, idealistic, academically hardworking, Catholic blue-collar kids from the post-World War II inner-ring suburbs of the Northeast. We were there and we saw the blight, the desperation, the exploitation. We were there and we knew the Bronx would soon be burning. We knew we had to take sides. By the end of 1969, after November 12th, 1969, we would all be militant communist revolutionaries.
I'm Charlie Dugan, playing here with the Meunier Mandolin and Guitar Society Orchestra. Back then, if you went to a Catholic high school, you had to go to a Catholic college. Because my older brother couldn't get a recommendation to Cornell because there had been an article about men and women living together in the same dorm. And they said, no, we can't recommend one of our students go to a school like that. So you had to pretty much go to a Catholic school. And the year before I went to Fordham, they had daily mass was required. The first year I was there, suit and tie was insisted on. And if you were to wear, during the winter, a turtleneck, to the cafeteria, one of the dean of men would come up to you and pull your turtleneck and look down and make sure you had a tie on underneath. That's the kind of thing it was. There was one guy there, he was the Student Peace Union, and he marched around the campus by himself when the ROTC had its field day with a sign against the war.
As the men of Fordham swing along, from our laughing lips will lift a song, which will rise and swell and mark the beat of the tramping feet with the music sweet.
He was a brave guy, I'll give him that, because this was in 1964. The widespread sentiment was that he was some kind of crazy commie kook.
I ended up at Fordham after some extensive search. My mother desperately wanted me to go to Smith. We went to Smith for an interview. I was there properly dressed in my brown houndstooth suit, sitting in the parlor, having a cup of tea in very dainty china. I had my white gloves on and having a very civilized conversation. It was at that point I decided, no, this was really not what I wanted to do. This is really not what I wanted to be. And the thought of being in New York City at that point was very appealing. Fordham was the only place I had applied in New York, and my mother was delighted because it was a Catholic school. In the long run, that really had very little effect. We all considered ourselves part of the working class. At that point, there were a lot of first-generation college students at Fordham, so that it was the sort of scramble up from the lower middle class to getting a college education. And I suppose it was some of the demonstrations that I had been involved in when I was still in Boston in high school that naturally gave me an affinity towards the anti-war activity that was going on, and also because I just was very rebellious against a fairly strict Catholic upbringing that was incredibly intolerant of anyone else.
I came to Fordham because I had a scholarship, a Regents scholarship, which paid half of my tuition, and I had a Knights of Columbus scholarship, which paid half my tuition. So that meant I had to go to a Catholic college in New York State. And there were only 2 Catholic colleges at that time that were co-ed, and I wasn't damned I was going to go to a women's school. And so it was here or Niagara, and I wasn't going to Niagara. So I only applied to Fordham. I had no idea that, I didn't have a clue. I was the first in my family to go to college, so I didn't really know much about it. I applied early admission and I got in, and it wasn't until years later that I found out that meant I was smart. I had already known about SDS because of the stuff that had been on television when I was in high school, like from Columbia and places like that. So I was already interested when I got here.
We organized a chapter of SDS, and it was quite a small group initially.
I was a founding member of SDS at Fordham University. The first thing we did was we heard that General Lewis Hershey was coming to Fordham to speak, and he was the head of the draft. And we took out an ad that said that SDS will not tolerate the presence of General Lewis B. Hershey on our campus. And it just so happened that a day after we took out the ad, he canceled. I don't think it had anything to do with us. I don't know. I mean, we were a brand new organization. Nobody knew anything about us, but it got us noticed. And shortly after that, there were recruiters, and we had a sit-in to stop people from seeing the recruiters.
He jumped at me at second degree assault. I would have arrested and thrown in jail.
That was really controversial because we were preventing people from exercising their rights. So we said, well, does their right to recruit trump the right of the Vietnamese to have a life?
You have refused to move. I'm going to have to ask the campus police.
Gentlemen, that's
A lot of people who were really upset at the war at that point came to join us, and a lot of people really decided they hated us. Everybody talked about it. Everywhere you went, there was discussions. You couldn't go to a party and not spend the entire time talking about SDS and the war. Eventually, we really did change a lot of people's minds about the war.
SDS was a mass student organization in the late 60s, the largest radical organization in the United States since the 30s, at least.
The factions actually took some time to develop. Originally, SDS was a fairly cohesive organization. And at a certain time, going into the demonstrations at Columbia and later on at Fordham, factions did develop. There was the revolutionary youth movement that really projected the idea that it was going to be middle-class youth that were going to make the revolution, and the Weathermen were another faction that was really focused on being a small, supposedly well-organized, but as it turned out, not so well-organized group that really had a terrorist view. Then there was Progressive Labor Party, which had the organized view of really trying to build a mass movement and align with the working class. At Fordham, SDS and the main faction was really organized by Progressive Labor Party and really shared that idea of building a mass movement and involving alliance with the working class. Progressive Labor Party was and is a communist party that looks at the idea of overthrowing the government because capitalism is not in the interests of the working class or the peoples of the world.
What was your first impression when you encountered PL?
They were organized and they got things done. You know, this was before really understanding much of the ideological nuance that was involved. You know, one of the things about PL was there was a lot of focus on really talking about the ideas and winning people over, as opposed to saying, you know, just pick up the gun and get to the streets, which really didn't seem to me to be a very good idea at the time.
What did you think when you first encountered SDS and you heard these people like me, for example, talking this Marxist rhetoric and like talking about Mao Zedong and talking about the need for violent revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat? How did that strike you?
It struck me as unrealistic. Not wrong, just unrealistic. Because I remember thinking that even though all of the different tenets of it kind of struck me as being quite true, that people on the outside of the campus weren't going to buy it, and that it didn't have relationship to people's lives.
I was involved in the PL. I was attracted to the discipline that they offered, as opposed to the kind of anarchic approach that was more widely spread. And they also were, at that point, very oriented towards reaching out to the working people in America, and they had a real international sense of movements in other countries. They were at odds with the Weathermen, and there was no way you could not be at odds with the Weathermen.
So what were the Weathermen like?
I think they were really inspired by the various small Leninist groups that existed in the earlier revolutionary stages, and they really believed that a small, hardcore group of people doing drastic and dramatic things could bring about change, and they seemed to be pretty heedless of the effect it had on the overall mindset of the population.
So I guess they were violent.
Quite, yeah. They were violent, which wasn't, I wasn't opposed to, there's always a time when things get a little rough, but it's better if you're, when that happens, it's in self-defense, and people can see that you're fighting back rather than initiating random acts of violence, especially ones that hurt innocent people, blowing up a building where there might be a night watchman there, or students doing after-hours research, that sort of thing.
What did you think then about violence? Violence on the part of the movement.
That's hard. I don't think I was ever particularly in favor of violence. I certainly wasn't. But I wasn't really opposed to it either. I just thought it was something that might need to happen. I remember being very frightened, but I also remember taking rifle lessons.
When were you frightened?
Whenever things got tight, and I was always scared. I didn't stop me, but I was always scared. I mean, since then, considering some of the work I've done, I've come to understand that being scared is not necessarily a bad thing. It's really being paralyzed by fear that is. But I was almost always terrified when we were having a demonstration. I don't know if anybody else knew it, but I knew.
So what made you sure that you were right, that you had to put your ass on the line?
Because it had to happen. And it was sort of, it sounds trite, but if it's not us, who? Somebody had to do what we had to do. And if you wanted to make change, sometimes it's what you need. You just have to put your ass on the line. And I've lived my whole life knowing that. I pray a lot that it's not me, that I'm not the one who has to do it. I'm really glad when there's other people who can do it and I can stay home. But sometimes you just have no choice.
Do you think that that the PL Worker Student Alliance faction was violent too? Or what was your opinion of violence in those?
I wasn't opposed to it. There were times when we were manned picket lines with garment workers down in Manhattan, and squads of union goons and thugs would show up, and we didn't hesitate to go up against them toe to toe. We felt that if you let people push you around, you won't get anywhere. So we weren't pacifists by any means. It was just a matter of what was the point. Generally, when we heard somebody say they wanted to do something really terroristic and violent, we generally thought that was police oriented, started out by police, what we call police provocateurs. Because a lot of times police informers or people in your group would try to get you to plan that kind of a thing so that they could arrest you. We ran into that a number of times, there's no question. We had some people that did their best to turn us to that type of terrorist activity, and we later did find out that they had relationships with the police, and which we would say, of course, we knew that. We always knew that guy was a cop,
November 12th was the day that the group at Fordham took over the administration building with the intent of sharpening up the idea of being against the college's support of the war. It really moved us from having sit-ins and teach-ins and talking and meetings with students into an action that crystallized the mood on the campus.
It was right here on the steps of the Student Center in November 1969 that the Students for a Democratic Society led a demonstration that was the high point of their movement against the university's participation in the war in Vietnam.
We really did our homework about ROTC and the relationship to Fordham and the war, and that ROTC was the local symbol.
Unfortunately, a majority of the students participating in the demonstration wanted to go to the ROTC offices against the advice of SDS.
There were really quite a lot of us, weren't there?
When we got there were ROTC cadets there attending classes and so on. They gathered and created basically a counter demonstration against ours. It became bitter argument rather than a demonstration. Once the abortive demonstration at the ROTC headquarters had ended, we regrouped in a lecture hall in Keating Hall, and we had a meeting, the idea for which we got from the Flint sit-down strike in the 1930s, led by the communists. And we said, anybody who wants to be involved in this demonstration, you can stay in the meeting. Anybody else, please leave now, because we're going to close the doors, and when we close the doors, we're going to have the demonstration.
That's when Janet pulled out her hammer. And she had this hammer she was going to use to break in. It was like, how are we going to get in? I've got a hammer. It was like, That's when I really got scared.
It was at this point that we threw open the doors and sprinted across Edwards Parade Ground from Keating Hall and down this sidewalk, hoping to outrace the security officers. We were a lot younger, so it wasn't a problem.
And meanwhile, because we thought that door was going to be blocked, barricaded.
Right. And so that's the way everybody got in.
But it turned out while we were doing this over here, everybody was just going in.
Right. And at this point, we had to kick in the doors to the administration building, and the sit-in began as we told Father Walsh to get the hell out. We were here to end ROTC. We barricaded the doors all around, moved file cabinets in front of them, and that was the beginning of the sit-in. It lasted throughout the evening.
And we did make ourselves at home. somewhat respectfully, being that we were all Catholics, you know.
Well, I don't see anybody being interested in destroying anything.
No.
I mean, just sitting around and getting talking. Really, there was
right.
There was a continuous debate.
And there's our fearless photographer.
There was only one professor there. His daughter was the same age as my son,
yeah.
more or less. But he apparently felt it was safe enough at that point to stay.
Yeah, that was a little troublesome.
Supporters started to gather outside here. They surrounded the administration building, chanting in support. We had quite a few people that joined us by scaling the wall here and into the bottom windows, where they were warmly greeted, especially since some of them came with food.
That's me, by the way.
In the striped shirt?
Yeah. And the reason why I was trying to unlock the window was I had the first reel that Bert had shot, and I stuffed it under my shirt.
Yeah, to get it out.
Yeah, he handed up the reel.
And
I jumped out with the reel, and there were people who were coming in. But when I jumped out, here's the interesting thing. Nobody knew in the building that Columbia SDS had sent up a contingent. And as I jumped through the window, one of the guys came forward and said, "We're from Columbia SDS, what should we do?" And I said, "Let's
You said, roll over that police car."
During the course of the demonstration, we had meetings throughout trying to decide what to do. We had emissaries from student government who came in and tried to talk us out of the sit-in. We weren't too impressed. We told them to leave and not come back. Yeah, our tactics were immoral. But of course, immoral tactics, were they as immoral as napalming an entire countryside, you know? That was to me, that's an immoral tactic. You know, torture, that's an immoral tactic. Shooting prisoners of war in the head as they stand in front of you, that's a pretty immoral tactic. Cardinal Spellman was blessing the bombs, you know, on their way to Vietnam. So that was pretty hard to take. Turning over file cabinets and leaning against doors. The secretaries were gone by the end of the day. They didn't even miss a day's work, I don't think. Maybe they missed the next day. Even if that were the case, they could still pay them. Keenan was our hand smacker. We had one guy smacking hands with a clothes hanger, I think. Even at that, you can see there were people inside who were trying to restrain our one hand smacker, you know? No, don't do that. Don't smack their hands. There weren't any real major injuries except to one campus policeman who was, I recall, as being really gung-ho, and he was really trying to hurt people, and somehow he wound up with broken ribs and a punctured lung, and he was in the intensive care in the hospital that night. And the next day was interviewed in the newspaper and tried to make a point of what a hero he was. We got word that the security guards had given up trying to dislodge us, and they were calling the city police. We had to decide whether to leave before they arrived or stay and force a pretty bloody, probably, and certainly violent confrontation as the city police stormed the administration building and dragged us out. A vote was taken among all the students there, and it was decided to leave before the city police arrived. We came out this window right up here onto the porch.
I remember coming out that window and seeing like these 30 fistfights going on.
Oh, yeah.
This is where the anti and the pro.
This is where the action was.
There were campus police trying to arrest those who were leaving the building. And at the same time, there were supporters, some from the campus and others from off campus. It's rumored there were some from Columbia and from downtown. And it was generally pretty much an hour of mayhem.
The weathermen were here then because Terry had come out first with my film. with a reel of my film, and somebody came up to him and said, "Hi, we're from Columbia SDS, and what do you need us to do?" And they later helped Matt Gillen. Matt Gillen apparently came out with handcuffed. He was handcuffed, and they let him escape. He went
around the door.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
he was in the door.
But the weatherman got him away from the cops.
Eventually, in the underground of the dorms, he met up with someone who had a hacksaw, and he managed to have the handcuffs removed.
Afterwards, before there was a march to the precinct.
Yeah,
afterwards.
Bob, you were there, right?
I was at the march.
Because we thought people were being held there, right?
Yes, that's right. That's whoever the people were arrested. We went up Webster Avenue, right? And then we were pretty cool. We're moving along, and all of a sudden, all these police appeared with the helmets, and a guy dressed like he had all kinds of stripes and bars and stuff, and he just basically he walked up and I don't know what he said, but we backed off pretty quickly.
It was a little bit at this point like the colonists on the green at Concord facing the British Empire. And we said, we'll skip the attack on the police station. Looks like we won't be able to free our jailed comrades tonight. We'll see what we can do in the morning. And that was pretty much the end of the evening.
Then when we all left, and then the next couple of days, they put out, I think, about 22 arrest warrants.
They had come to where you worked. They knew where you worked.
Yeah.
And you worked at the administration building. And those
at the registrar's office. No, they. I mean, I don't think that they were sympathetic about the anti-war particularly.
I don't think they thought about it one way or another.
Probably not, but I mean, they knew me, and maybe they had anti-cop sentiment. I don't know, but they spirited me out.
Were they a bunch of Irish ladies?
Old Irish ladies, yeah. It's great. We really kept it going through the whole trial. Exactly. I mean, I remember taking the 3rd Avenue L down to 148th Street to the courthouse. And they had snipers on the roofs in around where the courthouse was, and
Who did they think was going to shoot?
I don't know. We had demonstrators out there every time, and I mean, this was the South Bronx. I think they were terrified that the South Bronx was just going to go up in flames.
It really had a major impact on the student body at Fordham, and created the groundwork for a movement when the United States invaded Cambodia in an attempt to widen the war. Campuses all over the country rose up, and there were massive demonstrations. A lot of colleges had to close down. It was basically a student strike that was nearly universal. And Fordham, which had previously been on the very outskirts of any kind of peace activity, the support for the movement at that point was so strong that they had to shut down final exams and close the campus.
Being in New York for a while after college, I was involved in organizing a lot of the student movement, some at City College. Progressive Labor Party at the time was involved in an organization called CA, or the Committee Against Racism. And through that organization, we developed this idea of a summer project in Boston. Boston at the time was going through a very troubled integration of South Boston High School, particularly. South Boston is a very Irish working class section of Boston, well known for its racism. Any person of color walking through there would really be taking their life in their hands. And so what we felt at the time was that this was an opportunity of really confronting racism straight on in a place where it was really affecting people's lives. And so Committee Against Racism and Progressive Labor Party organized people from around the country to go to Boston and work in the neighborhoods, work in community organizations, confront the racists who were very active and very good with hockey sticks and baseball bats. They organized goons, basically, to come and beat people up. We had demonstrations at the high school. We had a demonstration at Carson Beach, which was a beach that was very near South Boston, that was definitely not integrated and very controlled by the racists. We organized an interracial group to go there. It ended up in quite a brawl. But what there was that was really positive was that there was a lot of publicity in Boston that there were people who were fighting this racism.
I live in the same apartment we moved into 30 years ago. It's a walk-up a building. It's an apartment not far from here. When I moved in to the neighborhood, it was a Jewish neighborhood, and the Jews moved out, and people said, there goes the neighborhood. And the Irish moved in, and then when the Irish moved out, they said, there goes the neighborhood. And then the Latinos moved in, and people said, oh, there goes the neighborhood. And now the Latinos are moving out, and the Pakistani and Bangladeshis and folks from Yemen are moving in, and people are still saying, there goes the neighborhood. And as far as I can tell, the neighborhood hasn't changed much. The color of the faces has changed. You know, people go to mosque now instead of going to church. It's the same neighborhood. It really hasn't changed. It's the same kind of people. It's still basically working class people struggling to get their families on a better track and looking to move to the suburbs at some point. And we've just kind of stayed through the whole thing and watched it, and we love it. We absolutely love it.
I live in Eagle Bridge, New York, which is quite rural. I'm a college professor, and I do research.
I'm a carpenter. I live in a row house in Upper Darby, downwardly mobile for sure, but with a cultural twist. All my kids are musicians. They play classical music and jazz and stuff. I was very happy to hear Bert say the other day that he went to a meeting that was marking the reestablishment of SDS. I think it's a good thing. I think it's needed. I think that what we've seen in the last 20 years has really been a degradation of the working class and middle class in this country. I think we are under terrific attack. Most people don't even know it, but we talked about this way back when, that we are being turned into consumer drones. There's no longer pride of being, I don't think, being workers. Everybody has to have their college degree. Everybody has to have their McMansion. Everybody has to have their all of these accoutrements. Both parents have to work. It just has to be that way. Life is getting harder and harder, more and more ridiculous, more and more contradictory, more and more absurd. Read the manifesto. That's all I can say.
In my own work, I'm a community organizer. I've been a community organizer since fairly soon after we graduated from college. But by that time, the Bronx was already begun to fall apart in a really bad way, and the Bronx was burning. And there wasn't anything that government was just like standing by. They were kind of talking about it like it was like what they used to refer to as benign neglect. And if the Bronx just fell apart, well, that was okay, and then they would just rebuild it later. But community people throughout the Bronx kind of got together to stop that. And we did. It took a long time. It wasn't easy. Some of the best housing in the Bronx is now owned by community groups. The Bronx did not come back, no matter what you hear, because of politicians. The politicians climbed on later on. It came together because community groups, many of which, ironically, came right out of Fordham University. Kids who were in the generation just younger than we were, who remembered SDS, but the anti-war movement was over by the time they got here, who pulled together and went into the community as organizers. I ended up using exactly the same things I'd learned in SDS out in the community, and I finally learned how to make the connection with the proletariat that I had never thought could be made. And it was really not about ideology, it turned out. It was about good old-fashioned organizing. You start where people are, and you let them talk about their lives, and you let them figure out how to work together. That it wasn't hard to get people of different colors and faiths to work together as long as they had a common goal. And it works. Organizing like so works.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your
so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no rights. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, they must give, and then the vanity of